There is a moment, familiar to almost everyone, when the body knows something before the mind has caught up. A sound in the dark, a letter you haven't yet opened, the sudden stillness before someone speaks words you sense will change things. In that interval, that narrow corridor between the signal and its meaning, something happens that is neither thought nor quite sensation. Call it fear, though the word is almost too small for what it carries. We tend to treat fear as a problem, something to push through, talk down, medicate away, or at least perform our way around. The culture around us is relentlessly committed to this framing. That fear is an obstacle, a glitch in the machinery of a well-lived life, and that courage means its absence. But sit with that assumption for a moment and it begins to loosen. Because fear is not occasional. It is not a malfunction. For creatures like us, aware of our own fragility, aware that time is limited, aware that the people and things we love can be taken, fear is structural. It is woven into the very fabric of being conscious and mortal and alive. That changes the question. The question is no longer simply how to get rid of fear, but what fear is actually showing us and what we do in its presence. Does it narrow us, or can it, under certain conditions, clarify? Does it drive us toward each other or away? Does it reveal something true about the shape of a human life, or does it distort everything it touches? And perhaps most strangely, is there a way of understanding ourselves so thoroughly that fear, without being or suppressed, loses its old grip? These are not new questions. Thinkers across centuries, some writing in solitude, some in the shadow of war or illness or exile, pressed into them with extraordinary seriousness. Their voices are very different from one another. It is worth listening to what they found. In the winter of 1569, a man in his mid-30s retired to a round tower on his family estate in the region of southwest France and began to write about himself. Had watched plague move through the countryside, had seen religious civil war tear France open along seams of doctrine and hatred, had lost his closest friend to disease, and felt the loss as something close to the amputation of a self. He was not a soldier or a saint. He was a minor nobleman, a former magistrate, a man of modest ambitions and immodest curiosity, and what he turned that curiosity toward with unusual candor was the texture of his own inner life. What he found there, more than almost anything else, was fear, not as an abstraction, as a working mechanism, one he could observe in himself with something approaching clinical detachment. Notice something that most of his contemporaries preferred not to say aloud. That fear rarely corresponds to actual danger. It is, instead, a faculty of the imagination, and the imagination left unexamined is merciless. It does not wait for harm to arrive. It constructs harm in advance, populates the future with disasters that have not happened and may never happen, and then insists that these constructions are more real, more worthy of attention, than whatever is actually present. The man walking calmly through a field is not afraid. The man lying awake rehearsing what that field might contain, the hidden drop, the sudden predator, the ambush, is consumed. And the consuming is the point. Fear, does not protect us from danger so much as it replaces danger with something worse. An endless, shapeless anticipation that the mind can sustain indefinitely, because the future never arrives to disprove it. He had seen this in battlefields and courtrooms, in men who broke before the first blow landed, in men who could not speak before a judge not because they were guilty, but because the imagined verdict had already executed them. He had felt it in himself, that seizing of the chest before a difficult encounter, the way the mind rehearses catastrophe with almost loving attention to detail. And his response to this was not to counsel courage. He did not tell himself or his readers to be brave, to suppress the feeling, to march into the storm with clenched jaw. He thought that advice was largely useless because it treated fear as a problem of the will, and fear is not a problem of the will. It is a problem of the lens. What proposed, quietly and without ceremony, was something stranger and more demanding than bravery. He proposed looking, not at the thing feared, but at the process of fearing, watching the imagination inflate, distort, and finally overwhelm the object it has seized on. He believed that fear, like most tyrannies, depends on not being examined. The moment you turn toward it with genuine attention, not to conquer it, but simply to see it clearly, it begins to lose its authority. This is not a trick, and it is not comfort. It is an act of honest self-scrutiny, and thought it was the hardest thing a person could undertake, precisely because the self doing the scrutinizing is the same self that constructed the fear in the first place. There is something almost paradoxical in this, the idea that the mind, which is the source of our terror, is also the only instrument we have for seeing through it, but did not find paradox troubling. He found it honest. And it is with this honesty, this refusal to dress fear up as something noble or to dismiss it as weakness, that the longer inquiry into what fear actually is and what it might demand of us can begin. Watched fear from a distance and saw it clearly enough, imagination outrunning reality, the mind conjuring catastrophes that the body then obediently suffers. But diagnosis, however precise, is not yet medicine. For that we might turn to a man who lived inside the catastrophe, who understood that the distance cultivated was itself a luxury. Seneca wrote his great letters and treatises in the shadow of Nero's court, where a philosopher's proximity to power was not an honor so much as a prolonged threat. He had been exiled, recalled, made counselor to an emperor he could not trust, and he knew with the particular clarity that only genuine danger provides, that death was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a knock at the door, possibly tonight. When Seneca writes about fear, he is not theorizing from safety. He is practicing survival of a specifically Roman and Stoic kind. His argument begins where it ends. Yes, fear is largely a creature of anticipation, but the Stoic response to that fact is not reassurance, it is rehearsal. Seneca's central prescription is the deliberate daily contemplation of the worst that can happen. Poverty, exile, illness, the death of those you love, your own death. Not brooded over in despair, but walked through methodically, as a soldier walks the ground before a battle. The logic is almost surgical. Fear feeds on the unknown shape of misfortune. It swells in proportion to how little we have imagined it. If we preemptively inhabit our losses, really inhabit them, feel their texture in the mind, then when misfortune finally arrives, it finds no virgin territory to conquer. We have already been there. We have already returned. There is something almost counterintuitive here, and Seneca knows it. Most people flee bad thoughts. Seneca tells us to move toward them on purpose, the way a doctor presses on a bruise not to cause pain but to understand it. And what you discover, pressing in, is that the imagination had enlarged the thing far beyond its actual dimensions. What arrives is nearly always smaller than what was feared. Suffering, once it is actually present rather than merely anticipated, has a shape, and shaped things can be born. He makes this point with a directness that only someone who has lost much can summon honestly.
What was hard to endure is sweet to remember.
The sentence sounds almost consoling until you notice its deeper implication. To remember suffering as sweet, you must have survived it, and surviving it required that you first stopped fearing it more than it deserved. Memory sweetens not because time softens, but because the thing feared turned out to be something a person could pass through. Seneca is not offering comfort. He is offering a method. Do not wait for hardship to instruct you. Go to it first in imagination, stripping it of the darkness that distance and dread lend it. That is the discipline. That is what he means by philosophy as practice rather than ornament. Fear, on this account, is not a sign of depth or sensitivity. It is evidence that we have not yet done the work. Yet where Seneca trusts the reasoning will to master fear, finds a terror that reason itself generates. He was born in Copenhagen in 1813, the youngest child of a melancholy father who believed he had cursed his family through some early act of sin. That shadow never quite lifted. Grew up brilliant and restless, studied theology, became briefly engaged, and then broke the engagement in an act he spent the rest of his life trying to understand, and produced in the space of roughly a decade a body of work so strange and so penetrating that philosophy is still catching up with it. He died at 42, worn out and largely dismissed. But what he had located, deep in the architecture of human experience, was something no Stoic catalogue of feared objects had ever quite touched. He called it angst, a word we have borrowed into English as dread, though neither translation is quite right. It is not fear of something. That is the first and most important distinction he draws. Ordinary fear has an object, the illness, the accident, the enemy at the gate. You can reason about those things, rehearse them, arm yourself against them, as Seneca recommends. But angst has no object. It arises not from what threatens us from outside, but from what opens up within us. It is the dizziness, says, of freedom itself. Think of what it means to stand before a genuine choice, not a trivial preference, but one of those moments where you sense that who you are is actually at stake. There is no script. No nature compels you in a single direction. You are radically, uncomfortably free. And that freedom does not feel like liberation. It feels like standing at the edge of a precipice, not because you might fall, but because you might jump. The vertigo is not caused by the height. It is caused by the recognition that the choice is yours. That is angst. It is the self encountering its own possibility and finding that possibility terrifying precisely because it is real. This is why, for the Stoic project cannot reach the root of the problem. And Seneca are treating the symptoms, the shaking hand, the pounding heart, while the condition they point to is something the philosophers have barely named. Angst is not a defect in reasoning. It is what reasoning, when it is honest, produces when it arrives at the truth about the self. That the self is not a fixed thing to be managed but an ongoing act of becoming, and that every genuine moment of becoming carries with it this vertigo. And here is the turn that makes so unsettling. He does not want you to escape the dread. He insists that those who flee it into habit, into crowd opinion, into what he calls the aesthetic life of distraction and sensation, have simply chosen a smaller existence. The anxiety cannot be rehearsed away because it is the very structure of what it means to grow. To become a self, a real and particular self rather than a role or a reflection of others, you must pass through the dread. It is not the obstacle, it is the threshold. Dread is at least oriented toward a self that can choose, a self that trembles precisely because it senses its own freedom. But Arthur, writing a generation earlier in Frankfurt, in deliberate isolation from the academic philosophy of his day, would have regarded that consolation as a polite fiction. There is no sovereign self directing the show, he insists. What you call your will, your wanting, your straining, your longing, is not yours. It is the will, a single blind and insatiable force that expresses itself through every organism that has ever lived, including you, without purpose, without rest, without mercy. Grew up watching his father's melancholy deepen into probable suicide, and he spent much of his adult life in a kind of lucid bitterness, convinced that the optimism peddled by and the romantics was a collective delusion. The world, he thought, does not tend toward the good. It tends toward nothing at all, it simply churns. And what we ordinarily call fear, the fear of losing what we have, the fear of pain, the fear of death, is actually the surface tremor of something far more fundamental. The will's awareness of its own fragility, the striving thing noticing that it might stop striving.
My body and my will are one.
That compression is worth sitting with. It does not say that the will inhabits the body or that the body expresses the will. It says they are identical, which means that when you feel fear in your chest, in your gut, in the tightening of your throat, you are not feeling a signal sent to you from somewhere outside. You are feeling the will itself, contracting around the threat to its own continuance. The anxiety is not about you. You are the anxiety. This darkens the picture considerably. Dread could at least be oriented, pointed toward God, toward a choice, toward a leap. Offers no such direction. The dread that saturates human life has no object that could satisfy it because the will is not trying to get anywhere. It is simply impelled to continue. And so we are born into wanting, we suffer under wanting, and we die still wanting, at which point the clock is wound again.
Every time a man is begotten and born, the clock of human life is wound up anew to repeat once more its same old tune that has already been played innumerable times, movement by movement and measure by measure, with insignificant variations.
And yet is not without exits. He simply insists they are rare, and that they are not achievements of the rational will, because the rational will is itself part of the problem. What he offers instead is a kind of temporary suspension. In the absorption of aesthetic experience, particularly music, the self forgets to strive. The will goes quiet. You are no longer a wanting creature trying to navigate the world. You are, briefly, pure perception. And then there is the harder path, the ascetic, who looks at the whole mechanism clearly enough that he can simply withdraw his consent to it. Saw tragedy as the art form that prepared us for this recognition.
We see in tragedy the noblest men, after a long conflict and suffering, finally renounce forever all the pleasure of life and the aims, till then pursued so keenly or cheerfully, and willingly give up life itself.
The word cheerfully is the strangest word in that sentence, and probably the most important. It suggests that renunciation is not defeat, it is recognition. Fear, in this world, does not dissolve through courage or through trust in a God. It dissolves, if it dissolves at all, when you finally see what was afraid all along, and choose, in some quiet and irreversible way, not to serve it any more. After bleak metaphysics, that vast, indifferent will grinding through us all, we arrive at a man who had every reason for fear and chose, each morning, to return to the work in front of him. Was emperor of Rome for nearly 2 decades, from 161 to 180 AD. He ruled during plague, during war on multiple frontiers, during the slow financial exhaustion of an empire. He outlived children. He governed men he could not trust. And he wrote privately, in a journal never meant for anyone else, a series of notes to himself, reminders, corrections, attempts to hold a philosophy in place against the daily pressure of a life that kept slipping away from it. We call that journal the Meditations. It is not a triumphant document. It is a working document full of repetition, as if the same lessons had to be learned again and again, which of course they did. What understood about fear is something quieter than what most of the thinkers we have visited understood. He did not encounter it as vertigo, as did, nor as the fundamental structure of existence, as did. He encountered it as distraction. Fear, for, is largely what happens when the mind abandons the present and begins to inhabit an imagined future, a future in which things have gone wrong, in which the worst has already arrived. The mind leaves the room it is standing in and walks into rooms that do not yet exist, and in those imagined rooms, it suffers everything in advance and nothing of any use. The Stoic tradition inherited had a name for this. It was a failure of attention, a failure to distinguish what is genuinely in our power, this action, this decision, this quality of effort from what is not. The remedy he kept returning to was not courage in any dramatic sense. It was simpler and harder than that. It was the redirection of attention to what is immediate and actual. He wrote to himself, repeatedly and without embarrassment about the repetition.
Concentrate every minute like a Roman, like a man, on doing what's in front of you with precise and genuine seriousness, tenderly, willingly, with justice, and on freeing yourself from all other distractions. Hay's translation.
There is something almost austere in that instruction. Not fearlessness, never claim to be without fear, but the continual practice of returning. And what he noticed, what the practice revealed, is that fear depends on projection. It needs a future to live in. Return to the present task and fear finds very little purchase. The room you are standing in is almost never as dangerous as the rooms you have imagined. And then, near the end of his notes, a sentence that feels like a man surprising himself with how simple it turns out to be.
You see how few things you have to do to live a satisfying and reverent life. If you can manage this, that's all even the gods can ask of you. Hay's translation.
That is where the long arc through fear arrives. Not at conquest, not at transcendence, not at the abolition of the self or its heroic transformation. It arrives at a man, imperfect and tired, sitting down each morning to do a few things well, in the time he actually has, in the place he actually is. Fear was always a question about what we take ourselves to be, how large, how permanent, how threatened. found that when the self is brought back to this moment, this task, this small, honest effort, the question quietly loses its urgency. There is nothing dramatic in that, but there is something that, if you stay with it long enough, begins to feel like freedom. What remains after all of this is not a solution. It is something closer to a portrait unfinished, as portraits of human beings tend to be. Showed us that fear distorts before it arrives, that the imagination is often a crueler executioner than circumstance ever manages to be. Seneca pressed us toward the discipline of rehearsal, the strange freedom that comes from sitting with the worst until it loses its grip. Open the floor beneath all of that, reminding us that some fears cannot be rehearsed away, because they have no object, because they are the very signal that we are creatures suspended between what we are and what we are not yet. Went further still, suggesting that the self doing the fearing may itself be part of the problem, a knot in something vast and indifferent, tightening around its own reflection. And standing in the middle of an empire, in the middle of a life he did not entirely choose, kept returning the mind to the present moment, not as an escape, but as the only ground on which anything real can be done. None of them resolved it. That is worth saying plainly. What they offered collectively is something more honest than resolution, a set of ways of holding the fact of fear without being entirely held by it. And perhaps that is all that is available to us. Not mastery, not the elimination of dread, but a quality of attention slowly developed that can look at fear and ask, "What are you telling me about what I believe myself to be?" Because the answer to that question changes things, not all at once, not permanently, but it changes them. Fear will return. It always does. The question is whether the next time it arrives you will meet it as a stranger or as something you have, at least once, had the courage to sit across from and study.